Hello, everyone. This is a new episode of the Global Judicial Integrity Network podcast series. My name is Melissa Evans, and we're here today with Edith Zeller of the Association of European Administrative Judges, who will speak about standards of judicial conduct. Judge Zeller, could you please tell us a little bit about your professional background for us to get started?
Hello, and thank you very much. Yes, I was appointed as member of an independent administrative tribunal. This was already 2003, and this was later on transferred to be the Administrative Court of Vienna. And ever since, I've been working as administrative judge here. And shortly afterwards, after I was appointed judge, I became already involved in the Association of Administrative European Judges, AEHJ. And I was assigned to the task of a Secretary General. So ever since, I've been deeply involved with the work of the association. It is a European-wide association, and I've always been very much devoted to the legitimate interests and needs of judges in Europe. Ever since I started my professional career as a judicial assistant at the Austrian Supreme Administrative Court, before I was always involved in these issues. And over the years, I not only became involved in the work of the association, but also in other international judicial projects. Mm-hmm. And since 2014, I have the honor to chair the association.
Oh, excellent. So why is it important to have standards of judicial conduct?
Well, individual judges are the face of judiciary, and judiciary is built upon the trust and the confidence of society into the independent judge. And this is a big value and most important. Because it's generally acknowledged that judicial integrity is fundamental to the rule of law. Also, an integer judicial conduct of each single judge and independence are deeply linked. Namely, integer judicial conduct encourages independence and impartiality of the judge and the judiciary as such. And on the other hand, independence again enables integrity. Thus, integer judicial conduct is the basis for trust of society in an independent judiciary, and it's necessary to uphold the trust of society again. This is really the basis.
So when there are issues of judicial conduct, what types of integrity issues usually arise in the judiciary? What have you seen before?
Well, on the one hand side, issues of integrity approached in the course of the private life of the judge or in the course of extrajudicial activities of the judge. These questions are quite sensitive. It's disputed whether there should apply higher ethical standards of integrity for judges as persons in their private life and higher moral standards compared to the rest of citizens or not. For sure, I think judges should not be isolated from the society in which they live, since the judicial system can only function properly if judges are in touch with the reality. So concerning standards of private conduct, there are national differences and also slightly differences in values. And it changes also in the societies. However, in general, it can be said that any professional activity of the judge outside his or her work as a judge must ensure that the dignity of their office is not threatened and no activities which would restrict their independence or jeopardize the impartiality are allowed. So this is for sure. The rest is a bit not fixed. It develops and it depends on the specific national background as well. So this is on one hand side, issues of integrity. On the other hand side, issues of integrity pop up in the judicial duties in office and in the exercise of judicial powers as such. There exist principles and rules governing judges' professional conduct and the obligations, the norms of a fair trial principle, etc. I would even say that integrity should be primarily measured by the judicial duties, because this is where the judge is seen as a judge. And for me, this is the most relevant aspect of integrity. So what standards of conduct apply to a judge in judicial duties? Is it different in the democratic systems? Well, I mean, there is maybe slight difference, but we have regulated norms and instruments, legal instruments for fair trial principles. And issues of integrity not only include these norms, but also there are also issues of integrity which are purely issues of judicial ethics and judicial moral. In this respect, it must be noted that ethics is not based on specific legislative, democratic ways to be generated. It can change also ethics. It must not be an obligation for a judge, ethics, from my point of view. It's a moral I should. Mm-hmm. And it should be based on voluntariness. Otherwise, it would be another form of disciplinary code, simply said.
Just to follow it to begin with.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And questions of ethic and integrity for judges below the threshold of legal instruments are ethical questions which a judge must pose oneself because of and in the course of having the position as a judge. For me, it's a constant self-control mechanism in the office, in the job. Questions which reflect such standards are, for instance, cases where no formal bias is given, as we have for everywhere, the legal instrument saying when you're impartial, whatever. But below this threshold, maybe there are grounds beyond this threshold. For instance, simple question, for instance, am I biased because I'm a cyclist and I decide a case of negligence of a cyclist? Mm-hmm. Just you have to ask yourself as a judge. Or when we have two parties who are unequal, one big company and one individual on the other side who does not much knowledge. So what is the guiding role of a judge in case the procedure allows the judge to have a guiding role? How far can a judge go explaining the content of the law to the weaker party or not? Insofar, where are the borders? Where is the border not to appear to be biased? And for instance, also internally, when I'm a presiding judge, how can I assure that my junior judge colleague feels totally free? Mm-hmm. So these examples show that the appearance as a judge and the impartiality is really relevant. And relevant is, in the final end, to ensure that there can be no legitimate reason for citizens to suspect any partiality. And it's also, for me, these integrity issues in the course of judicial work includes also questions of to have a good expertise and to work efficiently, which means high qualitative decisions and to do it as quickly as possible. As we know, and this involves much professional awareness. Judges should ensure that they maintain a high degree of professional competence, which means continuous training, mm-hmm. and also appropriate qualifications that they gain. They need to have a clear language in the decisions, to be transparent, and give a clear reasoning. This is even trickier and even more important when the law, than the national procedural law, allows, for instance, the exercise of discretion, or in the case of control of discretionary power of the administration, for instance, as an administrative judge, to explain clearly what you mean, why you decide this. This also involves a bit of courage to say it clearly, because it's easier to hide it. It's relevant in the first judicial instance, so that the parties of the case know what they appeal against to, what are the reasons. And it's equally important for the Supreme Courts because they give guidance for uniform application of law for future cases, to be clear, transparent. It's also relevant to avoid unnecessary formalism, and by a too formalistic approach, access to court is denied, and this is really not what it should be. And also, let me stress in this context, as a last example or a last issue I want to mention here, is that it is the judicial duty of the judge to protect the rule of law, to protect the rule of law principles. Each individual judge should do everything to uphold judicial independence at both the institutional and at the individual level. And again, this brings with it the need of judicial courage.
Mm-hmm. So going back to something you said a moment ago about how having integrity should be kind of a personal calling and not an obligation, I wanted to ask you about how codes of conduct can be effective to ensure that judges do maintain their integrity. So what should be contained in an effective code of conduct?
Yeah, well, it's complicated to say it in general terms because it also depends on the national background. But such a code of conduct should include definitely standards of conduct which a judge should observe. Mm-hmm. Such a conduct is also connected with ethics and morals. A code of conduct can be either an ethical code elaborated by judges or judicial associations very often. And this code gives guidelines and strengthens the inner independence of a judge. An ethic code contains always a moral should, what I said before. Mm-hmm. On the other side, a code of conduct can also contain certain obligations of judges, responsibilities, which are a must. It is not a should. Mm-hmm. And they are, in these norms are then binding and imposing also, for instance, disciplinary consequences and disciplinary sanctions. For me, it's relevant to stress that there exist different models on the setting of such a code. In the different countries, there are different practices. Relevant is also that the relation of such a code is clear concerning the code of ethics and code of discipline. From my point of view, an ethical code should not be formally legally binding, as a difference between ethical codes and possible discipline must be visible. Mm-hmm. So disciplinary codes are what I said before, they are norms, they are laws, they are normative obligations, and they're issued by the legislator after having passed a proper legislative process in a specific country. And such disciplinary norms should not only provide certain obligations of judicial conduct, but also provide certain legal protection of the accused judge and fair trial provisions, etc. And on the other side, you have an ethical code, which is not passed by a legislator, which can also be changed insofar more easy than a disciplinary code. And it's only a should, and it should be elaborated by the judges themselves. It should not be overlapping with the one with the discipline. And there should be, in every code, there should be the principles and the values listed in the Bangalore principles should be somehow made more concrete. And the basis should be also these values and the Bangalore principles as well.
Do you think that national judiciaries who don't have their own codes of conduct could look to the Bangalore principles for guidance?
Yes, definitely. Mm-hmm. I think this is there is no absolute need to have such an ethical code. There are countries where there is no code at all, and there are countries where the code is more or less orally. It's not a written form in a way. So there are different systems also in Europe, and this does not prevent. Issues of integrity and ethics and moral do not depend on having a written code, but it would be good to have it.
Mm-hmm. Of course. So in the event that there is judicial misconduct, what challenges does that pose for society?
Well, certain judicial misconduct leads to criminal and disciplinary liability. Sure. So legal instruments exist in all countries for such cases. This is clear. I want to turn to that kind of judicial misconduct which lies below this threshold. Well, in order to dwell on the challenges for society out of such a kind of judicial misconduct, let me first briefly turn to the challenges within judiciary, because the outflows are visible for the society as well. For me, from my perception and practical experience, I see that there's a certain trend in many countries on productivity. The number of cases decided very speedily is the only thing what counts. And excessive formalism might also go hand in hand with this issue of productivity, because it avoids too much work when you need not decide in the merits of the case. So this is a danger, I would say. And however, in the interest of society, this must not become the relevant denominator. Quality and quantity seem to be more and more contradicting, but it should not. The second challenge within judiciary is, in this respect, I want to stress the role of the courts, because primarily it is a court visible in society. Courts and their responsibilities towards society must not be neglected. This contributes to the appearance of independence of judiciary as such. Courts should inform society adequately about their activities. Courts must show up, open up towards society. And this implies also the needs to have certain standards in the relation to the media. So these are challenges for judiciary, I would say, within judiciary. And these internal challenges have also effects on the outside, on society, in case such a judicial misconduct appears, and has negative effects, definitely. The challenge for the society in case of such judicial misconduct is to stay attentive. Society must be attentive, and it's important that nevertheless they keep the trust in judiciary, that they don't only believe in what is said by Twitter, but they inform themselves and they know the background of the case. Because media, as well as also executive power very often, have a significant impact on shaping the public opinion on courts and on judges. As we know recently in more and more countries it's a problem. But public opinion is a very broad field, and public opinion has a high potential for both, for the better and for the worse. And this is, from my point of view, also one of the big challenges for society in case of such a judicial misconduct, to esteem what is real and to see what the media does, whatever.
Thank you. Could I just ask one more follow-up question? So you're speaking about public perception and the trust of the public, making sure that they get the correct information from the media. Would you be in favor of judiciaries making disciplinary proceedings public, either the documents from the hearings or the documentation afterwards? Do you think that making these public would then prevent them from getting misinformation?
Well, I don't think that it's good for the public trust. I think the criteria should be the criteria when a judge is disciplined, and for which reasons, and the procedural criteria, they should be public. But what is in the hearing itself, it depends also on the case. I think it's also a difference when if it's a private life issue of the judge, or whether it's a disciplinary case based on a misconduct in judicial office. So it depends on the case, but it's a sensitive issue. I fully agree, and I couldn't say yes or no in that way. But
yeah, kind of mixture. Some parts public and some parts
but it's
not.
sensitive.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you very much.
And for everyone listening, stay tuned for more episodes in the Global Judicial Integrity Network podcast series. Thank you.